Welcome to the Triage Method Podcast Q&A edition with me, Gary McGowan, and my co-host, Mr. Patrick Farrell. As you know, guys, Thursday episode is all about getting in and out info that you need, the Q&A episode. And this week's question is a simple one and probably one of the most Googled questions in the fitness sphere, and that is how to train your abs. That's not technically in like the top Google questions. I think in the top 5, you've got how to get a six pack, but kind of similar. So how to train your abs. This is something a lot of people ask. It's even something that quite advanced people ask at times, because sometimes people wonder, am I actually doing enough to train my abs? I know, people said that you just lose fat and then you see your abs, but I've never trained them and maybe there might be a benefit. So yeah, how to train your abs. So basically this is going to be abs 101. And I think the first thing to realize here is to step back and ask yourself, like I always kind of start at anatomy, because if you understand anatomy, everything starts to make a bit more sense. So firstly, what do we actually mean when we say abs, and generally it's fairly obvious, like that people don't just mean rectus abdominis. Like what people mean is their whole midsection. Okay. And that whole midsection is made up of the most obvious muscle that people associate with the abs, and that's the rectus abdominis. And that muscle basically runs down from the bottom of your rib cage and goes down to basically your pubic bone, you can say. Okay, so down around your genitalia. So it runs all along the front there. And it's going to vary between individuals, in terms of how that's actually built, so your genetics influence your genetics and your development and your embryology to influence how those abs are actually going to look. So some people, like, because the way that those muscles are built, the rectus abdominis, like they're basically little kind of like bundles of muscle within a fibrous sheet. So within this one big tendon, basically, you could say. So you can just kind of think of them as these little balls of muscles that are in this tendon. And that's going to differ between individuals. So some individuals have a very obvious 6 bulges or 8 bulges, or even 10 in some cases. Some individuals will have perfect symmetry between left and right, and some will have slight variations in terms of the left being a little bit higher or lower. And that's for me personally, like, there's a very clear difference in where those muscles are situated, left and right. And that's pretty much the result of the way that you've developed, your genetics, etc., that have led to the muscles to present that way. That's just how they insert. That's how they're built. And changing that overall shape isn't something that's necessarily possible. Like, you can change it slightly in terms of like muscle bulk, etc., but not really going to change too much. So that's the first thing, is to realize that rectus abdominis, that's the muscle that kind of gives the 6-pack look or 8-pack look or 4-pack look. And basically it's the way that those muscles are sitting within that kind of sheath, that tendinous sheath. That's what gives the look to those bulges, and that varies between individuals. So
Just
once you understand, go ahead.
Is it possible to have no packs, like as in one pack? Because the only reason I say this is because that is what Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson always says. He's like, I just don't have like 6 packs,
I don't think so. Like, I don't know I don't think I've ever come across any case where it's actually just one muscle sheath without any differences. But there are certainly differences in terms of like how like the same with a bicep, like whether or not there's a big muscle belly. Like this also is the same when it comes to the actual abs. So I don't actually know.
The only reason we really asked that was because, like, first of all, I know we're going to say it later in the episode, people just need to get leaner and they will become more prominent. And obviously, like, if you have a situation where the delineation between those packs, or whatever you want to call them, those muscle bundles, is quite low. And what I mean by that is, like, the actual bulk of the ab bundle, muscle bundle there, is not really like prominent. To me, that could be a situation where you even train your abs, but they're not prominent like that. And it can still look like you don't have a 6-pack, but it probably would get to a stage where you look like you have a 6-pack if you were down at 3% body fat.
Yeah, that's the key thing here, is that, like, when we're talking about these kind of muscle bundles being within this like fibrous sheath, like if you just have very low muscle mass and they're just not really well trained, or maybe the tendinous sheet happens to be a bit thicker in you, then it's just a case that it can be completely flat. And as a result, you could literally need to be 3, 4, 5% body fat to even see that. Whereas obviously, if you genetically have, more of a belly to that muscle, or through training, you've hypertrophied it tons, you're going to see it at a higher level of body fat. So it's kind of obvious when you think through it. But yeah, I think the vast majority, like I'm sure there are genetic anomalies. I'm sure they exist, but they're very rare. And I think it's very unlikely that anyone is going to have an anomaly where their rectus abdominis is developed as one muscle without any variation. I don't think that's very likely. But yeah, so that's the muscle that you're talking about when you talk about basically the abs. And the function of that muscle is like kind of intuitive. Like, and this is why I always get people to try to understand anatomy, is if you think about, if you had a string between the bottom of your rib cage, so your little xiphoid process, what do people call that again? Your solar plexus, people call it, yeah, solar plexus. If you had a string running from there down to your willy or your Virchana, if you had a string going between those and you shorten that string, what would happen? Those 2 points would come closer together, and hence you'd flex your spine. So you do a kind of a sit-up movement. So that's basically what would happen. And there you go. You've deciphered the function of the abs, just thinking about it, right? Origin, insertion, and a little string between. So that's what those muscles do. They basically allow you to bend forward, to flex your spine, to do a sit-up movement, or to bring your pelvis up towards you. So that's what they do. And they also play a secondary role along with all the other muscles that we'll discuss in a moment. So before we get to that, the other muscles, you've got your obliques, you've got internal obliques, which are lower down, and external obliques, which are higher up. They both basically have the same function of rotating your spine. So they allow you to rotate. So if I'm turning to the left to look out the window, they're the muscles that contract to produce that movement. So internal and external, the internal are lower down, the external are higher up. The external obliques are basically the ones that kind of give you that finger-like, those finger-like projections that you see when people are really lean, as if like there's these finger-like muscles that are sticking into their abs. That's basically what you're talking about. The serratus is higher up. That's sometimes confused with the external obliques, but that's more so underneath your armpit and higher up. It's actually the external obliques that dig into your abs, and then the internal obliques are lower down. And they're kind of the main superficial muscles that you'll see. So they're the rotation ones. The rectus abdominis are the flexion ones. If you think about the obliques and the fact that they can rotate you from one side to the other, what you also have to think about is, what if they're all working together? So if you have the muscles that are turning you to your left and the muscles that are turning you to your right working at the same time, the result is that they also help you to flex like your abs do normally. So if you are doing a sit-up type movement, you're also training your obliques, because they have different functions when working together versus when working in isolation. So that's important to understand too, I guess. And then you've got your muscles like your transversus abdominis, which is basically an internal muscle more so, not necessarily giving an external look, but is kind of responsible for holding everything together, you could say. It's like a big kind of big thin muscle that's also responsible with all the other muscle groups for increasing your intra-abdominal pressure. So if I want to tighten my abs and I want to push my organs back, transversus abdominis is important as it relates to that. So they're the main kind of muscles that you're talking about when you talk about the abs. You've got lots of other muscles that work in conjunction with those for function, but they're basically what we talk about when we talk about the abs. So if you think about all that put together, those muscles all work together as a unit a lot of the time. So one of the things that people think about when they first start to think about training the abs is, it's all like isolation. How do I isolate these muscles? And then you'll have another school of thought, like many people who are involved in weight training will just say that you don't need to train your abs because basically they're trained in any compound movement that you do. And that's true. And the question I think that people fail to kind of answer then is, why? Why actually is that? Because if I've told you that your rectus abdominis flex your spine, your obliques are responsible for rotation of your spine, then it's kind of like, wait, when I do squats and stuff, I don't do either of those things really. I might flex my spine a little bit, but it's, if anything, it's unintentional if I'm doing that. And the reason for that is because when all of those muscles work together and they all contract, basically what they do is, like, if you think about your your abdomen, so your kind of stomach region, like from the bottom of your rib cage down to the bottom of your pelvis. You think about that as like a cylinder, okay, or like a balloon. And that cylinder, as your abs contract, it basically compresses all the gas and all your organs and everything, but just think of it as gas for the moment. Compresses all the gas that is within that cylinder. So it's like a balloon. When you start to squeeze on a balloon and it gets closer to popping as the pressure increases, because basically you're compressing that volume, the pressure increases. So basically the effect that essentially has is to make your whole core region, your whole trunk stiffer. So it increases your whole trunk stiffness. So if Paddy had no muscles around his abs or around his trunk, and it was just literally a spinal column, you just poke him and he falls over. You know, that's all just going to compress in on top of itself. Whereas when the abs are contracted and all that gas is compressed and everything is now rigid and stiff, it's very difficult to move that unit now. Okay, so because you've got this.
The way I think of it, the way I think of bracing, it's like if you try to blow up a hot water bottle, right?
Yeah.
Which is also an extremely difficult feat in and of itself. But let's assume that you had the physical capacity to blow up that hot water bottle with just your lung capacity. But anyway, right? So like if you just look at that hot water bottle on its own, like, yeah, there's some rigidity to it, but you know, it's very flexible, malleable, moves around, right? But if you blew that up, right, and then put a cap on it, which is when you go and you do that Valsalva maneuver, you know, there's this structural integrity now to that hot water bottle, you know, because you've filled it up, and obviously the core here in this case is acting as the rubber of the hot water bottle, and it's giving that kind of rigidity to the structure now.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a perfect analogy. Another one is that's a good one. A good one when thinking about this is like an empty can versus a full can. So if you've got a can of Coke, you can't bend that over in front of itself. Like you can't just fold it in half. Whereas if there's nothing in it, you can just fold it in half very easily. And you can think about that in terms of like a squat. So if you have a barbell on your back, if you've got no fluid in that can, you've got no air in your abdomen, like you haven't increased that intra-abdominal pressure, that's just going to fold you forward, just like the empty can. Whereas when the can's full, it's very, very difficult to actually do that. So all those muscles, it's kind of counterintuitive, but all of your muscles that are responsible for flexion, typically like in a textbook, they're actually helping you to produce extension force. So that's the result of increased intra-abdominal pressure. When you contract all those muscles, that actually leads to a resultant extension moment, you can say. So it's the same as actually just contracting your back muscles against the barbell as it tries to push you down. When those back muscles are working along with all the ab muscles and the pelvic floor and your diaphragm, etc., all these things together increase your intra-abdominal pressure. And that's basically why your abs actually have to work quite hard during all those compound movements. So basically, it's any exercise where your spine is kind of being heavily loaded and you have to create that compression, you have to create that pressure to be able to withstand that. So that's exercises like squats, like deadlifts, even bent over barbell rows, overhead presses. Any type of exercise that's basically loading the whole body is going to be training the abs to some degree. And obviously, like any other discussion when it comes to training, there's going to be variations in terms of the response that you actually get. So that's basically like your kind of shotgun approach to training. You know, in the last episode, you mentioned the barbell row, and you said that the barbell row is not the best exercise for any one muscle, but it's hitting a lot of muscles pretty well. You know, that, and it's kind of the same case here, where you're like this, the back squat, the deadlift or whatever, they're training lots of different muscles. Are they the best exercise for your abs? No, but they are training them. And whether or not you need to supplement that with additional training depends on the response that you're actually getting. So if you're someone who, like, going back to what we said at the beginning, if you're someone who has naturally, you've kind of got flatter abs, you don't really see them, even when you're lean, they don't particularly stand out, but you want them to be more obvious. And you've been squatting, you've been deadlifting, you've been doing all this stuff that people have told you to do, but your abs haven't hypertrophied that much, then that's kind of a reason for you to turn around and say, you know what, I could actually benefit from potentially training my abs more. So basically, you're using your own experience and your results as feedback. And like any other muscle group, you know, If you want them to be stronger and you want them to be bigger and more visible, train them. Like, full stop. Like, we don't tell people not to train their biceps just because they do rows. And it's a very similar kind of case here, because you will actually have a lot of trainees who have had a favorable response to training say things like, you don't need to train your arms, or you don't need to do any isolation exercise, just do these compound exercises. And that will get a lot of people quite far. But if you're trying to, you know, bring up those muscle groups because they're genetically weaker for you or whatever, you're not getting a favorable response, then some more direct training is going to be beneficial. So in that case, if you've identified that your abs are not responding as you would like, and you're not getting the results that you'd like, assuming that you're not just too fat to be able to see them in the first place, if it's visible goal, you know, because that is realistically the main barrier in 90% of cases, is that people just aren't lean enough. But if you have gotten lean and it's like, I've had veins on my stomach, but I still can't see my abs, then that's potentially feedback to say, you know what, you could benefit from them being a bit thicker. And it's also the case that if your abs are thicker, you see them at higher body fat percentages. So if we're talking solely about aesthetics, then that is another reason that you could potentially want to train them. So yeah, assuming your goal is in the right place, it is probably beneficial to add in some supplementary abdominal training. And then I suppose the question is, what does that actually entail? And what that actually...
Before we get on to that,
go ahead.
Right, the question we have to ask, because this is also something that it influences our training methodologies, right? Especially like rep ranges you see being used and stuff with ab training, which is completely different than you would use with other muscles. You know, people are like, oh, I just do fucking 100 sit-ups, and they're like, you wouldn't do 100 curls to try to train your arms, you know. But anyway, look, if we want our abs to be more visible, right? And I mean this in terms of like all of the core structure. You know, we could be talking about obliques, we could be talking about whatever the fuck, right? By training them, are we making our waist thicker?
Potentially. You know, I mean, like it is one of those things where like people just like to answer that question by saying, oh no, your waist just won't get thicker. And that's an answer that satisfies people. You know, it's one of those answers that you're kind of willing to take a bit of or to tell a bit of a white lie to get someone to do the right thing. And a lot of evidence-based people do that, and it kind of annoys me at times. But like your abs are going to get thicker and your waist can get thicker, but it probably doesn't matter. Like, it's so unlikely to matter, as in like the differences you're talking about here in terms of like the muscle that you're going to be building are so small. And like, it's not like the muscles are solely growing like just out like this in terms of like, it's just like, oh, this is pure just waist thickness. It's like there's going to be, you know, muscle that's growing kind of left and right, and yeah, it's going to stick out a bit, but it's just not what you're concerned about when you're concerned about waist thickness the vast majority of the time. I think
most of the issue actually comes from people say people will say, well, avoid compound movements because they're like, oh, they make your waist thicker. And realistically, that's a kind of a misrepresentation. It's like correlation is not causation. But what you'll see is individuals who are really good at compound movements, such as squats and deadlifts, have really thick waists, you know? And then you could obviously correlate that and go, well, obviously these individuals, thick waists, they got that like causally from doing the compound exercises, you know. And then obviously you're like, well, I'm going to avoid that because they all have thick waists. But that's not the reason. The reason is, you know, they're good at these compound exercises because they have this fucking bulky tree trunk like core that allows them to stabilize and allows them to, like we were saying earlier on, how the core is involved in these compound exercises. It allows them to get better results from these compound exercises because the core is, you know, bulky and thick because of their hip structure, because of their rib structure, because of their genetics and stuff, you know. And this is also one of those things which people will say they want to train their abs and make their abs more visible, but they have this idealized view of what it means to be like shredded or have abs. Because I've seen people that have abs, they're lean, but they still have this like thick core, and that's not this like idealized V taper like in the case of men, like, and it's idealized V taper with this kind of like, you know, little V cut down near the pubic bone or by the hip bone and stuff. And it's like, yeah, you don't have that because you just have a thicker, you know, ab structure, you know, core structure, you know, like even though you have visible abs, you still have this bulky core structure. And again, this is one of those things where it's like, you can't really do much about that.
Yeah, and that's such a key point, is that like you're like when you're looking at these people, what you have to realize is that like the midsection that we're actually talking about, like it's just between the rib cage and the pelvis. And I mean, like if you've got a really large rib cage, which tends to be associated with high performance on these exercises like bench press and power lifts, you've got that big thick rib cage, you got a big thick pelvis, you know, these big massive strong robust hip joints and everything. You've got this massive bone structure. Then that's not going to put you in a position where you're very likely to have this kind of cute little small waist, but it is likely to lead you to be very strong. And then obviously, as you said, you got this kind of reverse causation, like what direction are we actually looking in? So yeah, basically like the answer to that question, like are you going to make your waist, are you going to make your waist thicker by making your abs thicker, or by doing compound exercises? It's just totally irrelevant, and it basically matters for nobody, you know. And what you also have to realize is that a lot of the time when you're looking at elite level bodybuilders and powerlifters, like the drugs that they use also lead to changes in their organs and things like that could potentially be contributing to changes in the way that the waist is actually manifest, especially these days. Like you do see a lot of that with the kind of bubble gut phenomena and stuff like that. So do realize
I also think that it is a case of just increased protein, or rather nitrogen retention within the gut, because of all the anabolics that they're on, you know, because that is one of the areas, again, we've discussed it slightly previously, where like you don't really store protein apart from, you know, actual muscle structure and obviously all the other protein structures within your body. However, recent research suggests that you do store nitrogen for however long, I don't know. I haven't had time to delve deep into the research, because, you know, I am in fourth year of college and I do have that to do. But you do store nitrogen in your abdomen. So I would posit that, you know, if you're on a fucking boatload of drugs that help you, you know, retain nitrogen, that might result in a situation where, you know, your ab structure, your core structure is a bit more bulbous.
Yeah, and like the other thing that's just fairly obvious is that like taking all of these drugs, in particular, like things like at the elite level, like you'll have people taking things like IGF-1 and stuff like that, really bad for your liver, like not fantastic for your liver. And like one of the kind of hallmarks of liver disease and liver dysfunction is basically ascites or ascites or whatever. I'm not sure how you actually pronounce it, but the retention of fluid basically within the abdominal cavity. So like you've got all that fluid that's building up in there that is a mass in and of itself, and that leads to an increase in waist circumference. So point there being, don't use like the extremes of bodybuilding and powerlifting at the highest level, where clearly a lot of drugs are involved, as your measuring stick here. You know, if you're just starting the gym, like you don't have to be comparing yourself to that. But yeah, basically, yeah, when we start to train the abs, you know, you can infer what would be useful based on my kind of discussion from the anatomy, and that's why, again, using anatomy or understanding anatomy is quite helpful. So if you're talking about the abs, you want thicker abs, you want a thicker six pack. It's very simple. You want to find some way to resist flexion. Okay. Is that what I meant? Yeah. Apply resistance against flexion. Yeah.
The way I always think of it, like
you're resisting extension.
Yeah, resisting extension. Like I always think of it like there's like a man with a rope sitting on your pelvis, and he has rope attached to your rib cage, like that solar plexus area.
Yeah.
And when you're holding, like you're trying to get some extension, you need something to hold that rib cage down. Otherwise, you just go completely back. So he's holding that rib cage down, and that's where why your abs are working when you are trying to, like, you know, extend the spine, hold that barbell, you know, and obviously the bracing aspect of it as well.
100%. And so like think about what that actually looks like in the gym. So obviously your basic crunch, you know, just doing crunches, man. Like they're actually quite effective, and probably like an underrated exercise, I would say, because obviously like ab training is something that has become like everyone wants to find a new ab exercise, and it's quite sexy to have like ab routines. Whereas if you can lock your feet down under something, so place your feet under something, place a pillow or two underneath your lower back, It depends on the range you have available. Like if you have a lot of spinal extension, and that's clearly like your active range of motion is very large, and the more pillows underneath your back. But if you're someone who's like, I don't really extend my spine much anyway, like you like one pillow or even just a slight pad underneath the back will be enough. But basically, if you do that, you've basically got a position where your abs are now in their lengthened position, your feet are locked down, so you've got some stability. And as you begin to crunch up, you're going to be taking your abs through the vast majority of their range of motion, challenging them throughout that. So it's just a super effective exercise. And the reason I say a kind of a crunch is that like the vast majority of the kind of ab training benefits are coming, you don't have to sit up to get them, so it's not about necessarily sitting up. It's just about getting through that kind of flexion range of motion. So if you're doing that type of exercise, really think about like the analogies that Patty was using, the analogies that I was using in terms of the anatomy, like dragging your pelvis towards your rib cage. That's what I like to do, is like think about, okay, if I've got a string there running from my pelvis, the pubic bone there, think around your genitals. Honestly, look, to be completely honest, one of the cues I actually use quite often when getting people to think about this, in terms of trying to engage their abs, is to try to put your willy in your belly button. Obviously, female clients mightn't understand that, but from my bros, put your penis in your belly button, or tuck your pelvis up under you, tuck your bum up under you. Like when you see a dog and they're kind of dragging their arse along, wiping their arse, it's a bit like that. You're tucking your pelvis up in under you, and that's actually a really helpful way to start to engage your abs, because it's like,
if you're not a degenerate and you want some actually effective cues, what you can just think of is trying to get that bottom point of your rib cage down to touch your pelvis.
I already said that.
no. I'm just, let me fucking finish. So all you're thinking of is literally bottom rib cage down to your pelvis, right? So again, looking at other exercises such as a sit-up, did you change that position? Like, obviously a sit-up still works your abs, but also it's going to work your hip flexors. But if you're doing a crunch and you're like, oh, you have to sit up the full way, like ask yourself, have you closed that position further down? Has your rib cage come closer to your pelvis? And if it hasn't, then you're not working the rectus abdominis. Like that, you've fully shortened that. Like obviously they are working, but you've fully shortened it. So no other shortening is occurring there. So it has to come from somewhere else, which is the hip flexors, which is another story in itself. But I just want to ask on this, right? Well, first of all, I want to say that like I think football crunches, over football, pretty fucking key for training.
Yeah, again, another one.
Because you can literally, because it's probably more applicable than someone bringing pillows or something into the gym. Because I know you have like those little ab pad things that people use, but they're not really a commonplace around the gym, But having something like a football, you can lie back over it and then again keep your hips in place, and you have your legs on the ground, and crunch up. So you're going through that full range of motion and just focusing on bringing the bottom of your rib cage down to the top of your pelvis. But before I got on to, or that's what I wanted to say before I got onto this question, and that is, right, so if it is flexion, is there a difference between my ribs coming closer to my pelvis or my pelvis coming closer to my ribs, right? And what I mean by that is, take that crunch, for example. I do it on a football, maybe I can add some weight. We'll talk about rep ranges, I presume, in a second. But maybe I can add a weight or something on the football crunch, and I'm doing that crunch. But effectively, what I'm doing there is I'm bringing the bottom of my rib cage down to my pelvis, right? But say I do something like a hanging leg raise, right? Now I'm bringing, well, for a lot of it is literally, again, hip flexion. You're using your hip flexors to bring the legs up, but obviously your abs are still working doing that. And like that is a quote unquote compound exercise. But is there a difference if we'll call it development, or even looking just at anatomy, is there a difference if I bring my pelvis, like tuck my pelvis up towards my rib cage, i.e. bring the top of my pelvis towards the bottom of my rib cage? So effectively it's the same movement is occurring at the ab, at the ab level, but they feel different because that movement has come from a different position in terms of the first one came from the top down and the second one came from the bottom up. Is there a difference between those two if the same movement is actually occurring?
Yeah, this is a really good question, because this is something that actually gets talked about a lot, is that like you need to have, you need to have an exercise where you're crunching and one where you're raising your legs. Whereas again, it kind of misses the point in terms of like what we're actually discussing. And the main reasons that people maybe can have different outcomes or feel different perceptions or maybe more soreness in the days after and things like that, mainly the result of differences in the magnitude of the resistance. That's the first thing. So how much resistance you're actually dealing with. And also the distribution of that resistance or the resistance profile. So like the where you're dealing with the greatest amount of forces is different. And also things like inertia. So if you've got like, if you're doing leg raises of some sort, or even you're doing reverse crunches with straight legs, like because the resistance is spread out so far from where you're actually working, there's differences in that exercise as well. So there are different exercise variables there. And if you think about, for example, the straight leg raise, really, really challenging exercise where you're dealing with a lot of resistance, a lot of moving parts. And basically the greatest challenge there is as that muscle is beginning to lengthen again. And that's especially the case if you're doing something like, for example, people do leg raises off the edge of a bench, you know, where they hang on to the bench and they let their legs hang down as far as possible. And they're really dealing with the most resistance when the abs are kind of in that more lengthened range as they're really stretching. And as a result, there's kind of more soreness that can come from that. And a definitely a different experience versus something like a crunch from the ground where you're starting with your abs kind of, you know, in a fairly comfortable position, like they're not that stretched. And then the challenge is in the shortened position. So there are differences for sure between these different exercises. But it's not necessarily that like the lower abs are one functional unit and the upper abs are another functional unit. It's more so differences in kind of basically the perception of the exercise and the results of the exercise because of changes in resistance and changes in resistance, both magnitude and in terms of the distribution of that in the exercise. But, you know, leg raise variations can be really useful, but there's a lot of moving parts. And that's one of the difficult things for people is, you know, because if you're doing a hanging leg raise, like your quad strength, your hip flexor strength, your grip strength, your lat strength, all that stuff is also a strong limiting factor. And that's fine. You know, if you can juggle all that stuff, like they're a great exercise and there's absolutely no problem doing them. But if someone is saying to me, you know, my abs are a real weak body part, I never feel them during all these exercises, I might try and create something with a bit more restraint where it's really just nailing in that kind of flexion type movement on its own. I'd try to bring that in so that we can be a bit more specific.
Just with those hanging leg raises, because it's actually a bit of a pet peeve of mine because I think people just don't do them correctly at all. But basically, if I keep my legs straight, because people love to do the straight leg version, even though they just don't have the strength for it. If I bring my legs up to 90 degrees, so I'm hanging there and I keep my legs straight, I'm like, yeah, I'm a fucking animal. And I bring my legs up to, again, roughly 90 degrees. Have I actually trained my abs, like the rectus abdominis? Like obviously there's bracing involved and stuff like that, but is that actually effectively training my abs, or is that more just hip flexors? I suppose we're going to have to just talk about hip flexors because they're fucking involved in everything, but go on.
Yeah, that's a hip flexion exercise. You know, I mean, as you're kind of alluding to, there's an indirect challenge involved in that. And that's kind of the case with a lot of these exercises, is that the challenge on the abs is pretty much secondary to what you're doing. In that if you're doing a straight leg raise like that and you're only bringing it up to 90 degrees, the vast majority of the time, the spine doesn't actually move. And sometimes, interestingly, the cueing that's given is to not move the spine, which is funny. So basically you're doing pure hip flexion and the abs will be working because they have to stabilize you and you're trying to keep your position and that resistance is changing and you're moving and you want to swing. So the abs are working for sure, but it's just a really ineffective kind of way of going about things and quite an odd way of going about things, especially if the rest of your training is quite specific and quite direct. Like that's just a very indirect way.
Basically the same as like a compound exercise works your abs. And I'm like, why would you choose a low return compound exercise?
Yeah, that's exactly it. It's kind of like saying like, I'm going to train my abs now. What are you doing? I'm doing squats. Yeah. Just for abs, like not for your legs. Like it's kind of the same thing here. Like your hip flexors, quick kind of 101. So your hip flexors are basically the muscles that are responsible for flexing your hip. Flexing your hip is basically bringing your leg up in front of you. So if you're kicking a ball, your hip flexors are playing a key role there. So one of those muscles is actually part of your quads. So it's the kind of triangular shaped muscle that hangs down at the top. It's called the rectus femoris. So that crosses the hip. And as a result, that plays a role in actually flexing the hip. And that's why you'll feel your quads working a lot of the time during these exercises. And then the other muscles involved in hip flexion are basically the iliopsoas. So that's kind of made up of the psoas major and the psoas minor in some people. And then your iliacus as well, which is kind of within the fossa of the ilium bone, I should say, of your pelvis. But anyway, basically that's irrelevant. Basically the point there being that they're a group of muscles, the hip flexors, that are responsible for lifting your legs up in front of you. So they're working a lot of the time during these exercises. And sometimes what can happen is that people actually mistake those muscles as well for being part of the lower abs because of their location. They're very close to where the lower part of your rectus abdominis inserts. So as a result, you can kind of feel like, oh, this is more of a lower ab exercise purely because of those working as well. So it's important to differentiate those. But yeah, basically what we're trying to do, guys, is trying to find some way to resist flexion. It can be a resistance.
Before we do that, just go ahead. People will be like, why didn't you tell me? If you do want to train, you do a hanging leg raise, you need to tuck the hips, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
If you're trying to target the abs, like if you think of that, like if you're having sex as a guy, go to the vulgar route because Gary was fucking doing it.
Jesus, I didn't want to go this far.
You contract your glutes, or if you're doing something like a hip thrust, and you contract your glutes and your pelvis kind of tucks under you.
Exactly.
That's effectively what you need to do if you're trying to do a hanging leg raise. So if you can't do that with your legs straight, you're not training. Well, not effectively training your rectus abdominis. So a better way to do this would, first of all, have something at your upper back. So if you're going to do them hanging, hang from that, but have something like a barbell across your shoulder region. So you have something that you can kind of push back into with that, or you can use something like that. I think it's called Roman chair. So something like that, where you have stability at the rib position here, and then what you want to do is bring the knees towards the chest, right? Because again, if you don't have that huge moment arm because your legs are not fully extended out in front of you, tucking that pelvis under is easier. So effectively just thinking knees to chest, and you see this with like CrossFit athletes and CrossFit gyms and stuff where they have that like toes to bar exercise. That's a much more effective way to do this. Now they use a lot of momentum to do that. They're basically like kipping toes to bar. But if you're trying to effectively like isolate your abs, what you would do is not kip to get your toes to the bar and, slowly crunch those toes to the bar. And if you wanted to progress it, you want to have some progression scheme, start with getting your knees to your chest. And once you're able to do, 10, 12 reps with that, what you can do is bring your knees to your chest and then extend your legs out. Mm-hmm. So they effectively touch the bar, so straighten your legs, and you can progress the straightenedness out of those, and on the eccentric allow them to come down. So you're building that, it's a stronger challenge in the eccentric challenge because you've increased the moment arm with that, and hopefully that'll eventually build to you being able to do strict toes to bar without a lot of kipping involved.
100%. And then the other thing that probably comes up in this discussion a lot of the time is, so what's the story with planks? And basically, if you think about what a plank actually does, is a plank is basically just you holding that position of like as if you're going to go into flexion, but you're just doing an isometric. So it's just an isometric. So it's a plank is to kind of normal ab training as like doing let's say doing a dumbbell bench press and just holding the dumbbells kind of in the middle. You're just holding that for 60 seconds or whatever. So there's nothing special about planks. It's just that they just happen to be really convenient and accessible anywhere you do them. And you can actually progress that in a similar manner to the way you progress any exercise by basically adding weight. And one of the things to note here, it's kind of a pet peeve, is that when people do weighted planks and they're like, oh, I'm doing weighted planks with 80 kilos. If the weight is on your upper back, it's basically zero. Okay. So it's doing nothing. That's where you should put it for push-ups. But if you're doing planks, put the weight like on your arse or on your lower back, because that's where it's going to be challenging. Because I have seen people do that.
Yeah. If you're doing planks, like if you basically go into full spinal extension, and your rectus abdominis are, pretty much doing nothing. Yeah, they are obviously fully lengthened, well, fully to whatever extent lengthened. Like, you have to actively contract your abs, is what I'm saying. You have to actively be engaged. It's not like, oh, I can just get into this fully length, like using Gary's example there of just holding dumbbells. It's not like it'd be more appropriate for like a barbell bench for this one. It's not like I'll just let the barbell
rest on your chest,
rest on my chest, and I'm doing an exercise, I'm exercising. Like, that's effectively what you're doing if you let your abs sag out when you're doing that exercise. Like, you can't just get into this fully or however fully lengthened position and then not contract whatever. But even if you got into that position and contracted as hard as you fucking could, we could argue that there's some training effect there, but you would probably get dragged back into that mid-range position then. And you have to be active in this.
Yeah, and if you want to get the most from it, like what I cue people to do is, like, firstly, do as we said previously and squeeze your glutes hard and imagine you're tucking your pelvis in under you. But the other thing that's really, really nice here is imagine you're trying to bring your elbows and your toes towards each other. Okay, so dragging your elbows down like you're doing a lat pull down, and dragging your toes up towards you without actually moving, obviously. Basically, what that does is forces you to create all of that tension kind of anteriorly on the front of the body, and it's a really nice exercise in that sense. And it's also a nice way to kind of increase your kind of hollow hold strength, you could say. If you're trying to improve your push-ups and kind of get those more gymnast like push-ups where you're kind of getting that hollow body strength, they're actually a nice way to kind of replicate that as well. So yeah, they're a good exercise, but just treat them like any other exercise, and don't just say, oh, I'm going to see how long I can hold this position. Like, make it hard. Make it hard for yourself. That's the goal, is to get an adaptation. And then when it comes to the obliques and training the obliques, basically they're going to be working, as I said, in any exercise that you do from a flexion perspective. So whether that be the crunches, whether it be the leg raise variations, or whether it be using a machine or a kneeling cable crunch, I forgot to mention, probably my favorite ab exercise, really, really good exercise. So whatever exercise you have chosen, your obliques are going to be working there. But there's also a case for actually training spinal rotation in and of itself, because you want to, build strength in rotation, especially if you're doing a sport that involves that. There's potentially merit there. And also there's other muscles other than just the obliques involved. So any exercise where you're training rotation, like the kind of quick answer here is, use a Cybex or Atlantis trunk rotation. But like, especially in Ireland, like, we just don't have those types of machines in many gyms. So yeah, there's machines out there that are unreal for just nailing your obliques, nailing that rotation movement. If you have access to them, by all means, please use them. But there are other ways you can do it. You can use different cable setups to try and train rotation. So for example, if you've got a cable in your hands, you're sitting on a bench or you're standing even, one of the things that people will have called them before are wood choppers. You're doing a kind of wood chopping type motion. Like, when you're just standing, there's a lot of moving parts there. So I like to get people sitting, find a way that you can kind of get stable and really kind of slow down the movement is a nice way to do it. But there's not much of a point in getting into all the specifics about that here on the podcast, because you need to see these things. But basically, a way that you can challenge rotation and get stuck into it. The Russian twist is an exercise that's always been popular when it comes to the obliques, because it's basically that rotation type movement. I like those exercises like that. But what I say to people is that the goal is not just to touch the ball off the floor. What a lot of people do when they do this exercise is, if you're just listening, right, what people do is they get the medicine ball, they just move their arms and they just touch it either side. The goal with an exercise like a Russian twist or any oblique exercise is to turn as far as you can at the spine. So if your hips are locked in, your legs are locked in, imagine you're trying to turn your chest as far away from that direction as you can. And just do it nice and slowly. And that's basically how you start to execute those movements. But yeah, the way I look at it, when people start to train their abs, and if they want to make it a more specific thing, pick one exercise for flexion and one exercise for rotation, and you're grand. You don't need to complicate it much beyond that. Find the ones that feel good, that work. Maybe have a bank of exercises you can change up over time to keep it interesting. But it's really, really not a complicated process.
I have nothing else to add.
Fantastic. In that case,
okay. To finish this out, we did touch on it, but all of this discussion is irrelevant if you have body fat to lose. Like, It doesn't matter how many reps, we didn't touch on that, we need to. Doesn't matter how many exercises you do, how many reps you do, whatever. It doesn't matter how unbelievable of a burn you can get on your abs. If you have excess body fat that's covering your ab structure, like, you're not going to be able to see them. So that is realistically the advice that the vast majority of people need to adhere to see their abs. Like, most people have some sort of visible abs, they just have fat covering them. So if you want your abs to be visible, like, in a bikini or on the beach or whatever, you're going to have to lose some body fat specific to your ab area. Now, as with all of that discussion that we've discussed previously, like, there's a genetic element to it. So maybe you store your body fat on your abs. That's unfortunate. You're just going to have to get leaner if you want to get them more visible. And this is the case for guys a lot of the time, because storing fat on your abs is more of a male fat distribution pattern. Whereas females, it's usually the lower half. So like for females, like, they can have fully visible abs and be 30% body fat, whereas for guys, usually that's not the case, and they have to get down very low to have their abs be visible. However, and we have discussed this before, you will also see individuals that just have, we'll call it, really favorable fat distribution patterns, and they'll be male and they'll still have high body fat, but their abs will be fully visible. And again, obviously that gets idealized. People are like, man, this guy was bulking and he stayed so lean, when in reality his legs got fat, his back got fat, his face, his neck, his chest, everything got fat, but just genetically he doesn't store fat on his abs. So it looks like he stayed really lean because that's what you associate with being lean, visible abs, So there's a huge genetic component to that. But again, you can't really control your genetics. So what you can control is how much food you put in your mouth. So that's the thing that you control. And as a result of controlling that, you lose body fat and you reveal whatever it is that you can reveal, like get as low body fat as you feel is or deem appropriate for your goals and obviously your lifestyle, etc. And get those abs popping, right? And do you have anything to add to that, Gary?
Only thing would be, like, you're absolutely allowed to have a goal here that does not involve body composition. Like, for example, like the abs and the obliques and like rotation strength and everything can be really important in some sports, and even in some functional tasks, you could say, everyday life, depending on what you're doing. So absolutely, you can still train your abs without even ever worrying about seeing them.
One honey, yeah. But yeah, so obviously, again, like, we're not saying that you need to have your abs to be visible to be validated as a human. I really couldn't care less if you have abs or not. Realistically, most people wear clothes that cover their midriff for 90% of their life. So realistically, it's irrelevant. However, if you do want to reveal those abs and you want to put that as part of your goal set, then you're going to have to probably lose body fat for most people. Right. Now, we didn't touch on it. We need to quickly touch on it. Gary, rep ranges for abs. Are we doing 50, 100, 1,000 reps, or are we treating it like any other muscle group that we would train and progressively overload in a probably more, we'll call it a lower to moderate rep range?
Yeah. So for me, with abs, I rarely touch rep ranges as low as I might on other muscle groups, but it's not because of any mechanistic reason. It's purely practical, so yeah, we were talking about all the exercise we brought up, imagine like trying to do sets of 3 like crunches and stuff. It's just not really practical. Like, you can try.
You're really, really weak.
Yeah. Or you're using like ruthless tempo, that can be a super helpful thing. Is like, if you're doing like 6-1 crunches or something, like, yes, three reps of that is going to be absolutely ruthless. But for the vast majority of the time, I'm probably somewhere between 8 and 20 reps when I'm programming for abs. But it's mostly because of practical reasons. It's not because you need to do higher reps for abs. Like, if anything, I think the arguments I've heard in favor of fiber type specific training for abs would probably favor lower repetitions. However, I'm not massively familiar with the fiber type distribution of the abs, how that varies between individuals and how it varies.
It makes more sense that they would be like moderate to more endurance type, because they act as stabilizers, if you want to call them that.
Yeah, but I'd even
not familiar myself.
Yeah, like I'm pretty sure. I think that the rectus abdominis themselves have maybe above average fast twitch composition, but I'm not 100% sure. And even
also,
in that,
we should just say that probably isn't even something that I would.
Yeah, that's what I'm about to say. Is like it just doesn't matter. Like to be honest, like listening to arguments for training for hypertrophy based on fiber type, it probably doesn't matter. Just probably doesn't matter at all. Like, to be honest, you just need to get close to failure on a reasonable repetition range, somewhere between 5 and 30 probably most of the time, and you'll be fine. And that's the exact same for abs. That's how I think of it. I think a lot of people just do sets of 50 and stuff like that because they feel the burn and they kind of like that feeling. But yeah, just same old repetition ranges really.
And people will use like set structures and effectively just get a metabolic stress. Like they'll do 50 crunches into 50 hanging leg raises, and it's basically just working the same muscle group. And you get this like 10-second rest in between. Or people will do stuff like, I just do really, really short rest periods in between my ab training. Like I do a set of 20 and I rest 10 seconds and I do a set of 20, and basically they just end up doing like rest pause training for their abs, or myo reps or whatever the fuck you want to call it. So I would just do normal resistance training protocols. We'll say again that kind of 5 to 20 rep range. Maybe even a little bit higher for abs, just from a practical perspective. It might be a little bit easier to do that. And what I mean by practical, like say you're doing a cable crunch, like Gary was saying there, like it might be impractical for you as a 60 kilo individual who is strong enough to do the full stack on the cable machine. We'll say it's 120 kilos. Like having 120 kilos pulling you back, like it's just impractical. Like you just can't resist that effectively. Like other things start compensating, whereas doing 30 reps with 30 kilos, like it's a little bit easier to manage, just practically speaking. But yeah,
that's all I have to say, bro.
That's all I have to say. So let's wrap this up, Gary.
Sweet. So as you know, guys, you can get involved with the Triage boys and girls by getting involved in the Triage Method community. So Facebook group, free access on Facebook. You can get involved there, have some discussions, chat with us, ask questions, etc. Also join the newsletter, Triage Method newsletter. You can find that linked below. Goes out every Sunday. Useful resources and a catch-all of the content that we have been producing. We do have coaching spaces available, both online, one-to-one, and group coaching. So if you're interested in those, do get in touch. The ebooks and program templates in the bookstore, check them out. If you have a bit more reading time, you want to kind of learn some more about the training process, there might be some stuff in there of use to you. And then follow us on our socials, of course, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube in particular, I would recommend. And finally, I highly recommend that you guys subscribe to the podcast, leave a review if you'd like, unless it's a scathing, awful review, in which case I don't want to hear it. Just leave the 5 stars. I'm only kidding, but give us feedback in private,
or just review the podcast. You can do that, even if it is a 0 star. I don't think you can give 0 stars, but a 1 star.
Yeah, I don't really care, to be honest.
I listen to this every week and I hate it. That's perfectly fine by us. I have nothing else to add except, with all this training stuff, like it can be very theoretical and seem kind of like esoteric, and you're like, what is this? Like a lot of this stuff, you need to kind of visualize it. So, get onto the YouTube channel and look at the exercises. Like there's obviously a fucking fuck ton of articles on the website that go into the whole training process, goes into, reps, sets, the actual rationale for all of this stuff. And over the summer, Gary will be writing more stuff in the anatomy and all that kind of stuff. What's the name of that section of your training thing? Looks like Gary froze, so I'm just gonna leave it here. Either way, there is an anatomy section on the website, so if you are interested in getting a better knowledge and understanding of the training process, then get on the website, get on the YouTube channel, and it's all there. Anyway,